Good morning. It's good to see you this morning. We're studying from Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. We'll go through verse 3, and then we'll pick up also verse 7. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and then finally verse 7. This is involving the threefold promise to Abraham. And the interesting thing about it is that this really sets the stage for the outline of the Bible. The three-pronged promise, or the threefold promise, really is the outline of how the rest of the Bible story is told, in fulfilling all three portions of the promise. And so this particular passage really puts in a nutshell what the entire story of the Bible is about. So let's look at it. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. God speaking to Abraham. First of all, remember that Abraham had come from Ur of the Chaldees, which was near the Persian Gulf, near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They flow into it. And he had gone far north to the city of Haran with his family. But now God reiterates the promise in chapter 12. He says, "Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, and go to the land that I will show you." Verse 2, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you be a blessing. And I will bless him that blesses you, and him that curses you I will curse. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Now let's go down to verse 7. "Unto thy seed will I give this land." You did not fail to see the three promises given to Abraham, or as I call it, the threefold promise to Abraham. Number one is found in the first line of verse 2. "I will make you a great nation." That's number one. Number two, and we're going to do them in chronological order, number two is found in verse 7. And that is, "Unto thy seed I will give this land." So we have a nation promise, and we have a land promise. But then the third leg of the promise is found in verse 3, the last line. "In thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." So the rest of the Bible is told simply, explained, and how this promise, or these promises, are fulfilled in the life and the story, and also in the descendants of Abraham. So let's watch how this begins. The first portion of the promise, as we mentioned, was the nation promise. And the first time that Israel is called a nation is found in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, and you'll see it there on the chart on the left-hand side. So they were called a nation, but how is it that they were called a nation? They are the descendants of Abraham. You might recall that they had gone down to Egypt through the leadership of Joseph, who had been a great-grandson of Abraham, and there they had been enslaved for hundreds of years. But God said that this would occur in Genesis chapter 15. When they came out under the leadership of Moses, which is in the book of Exodus, they go straight down to the Mount Sinai, which is on the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. And there the scene takes place, which we find in Exodus chapter 19 and Exodus chapter 20. And here God says to the Israelites, speaking through Moses, and he calls them a nation for the first time. He says that you shall be to me a nation. He calls them a holy nation. That's verse 6. But as he begins it, he says, "If you will obey my voice and keep my words, then you shall be my unique possession. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests," verse 6, "a holy nation." Now, there are a couple of things about this that we need to note. Number one, you saw also in this one that we have a condition. That is, he tells them at the beginning, verse 5, he begins with that big word, if. "If you will obey my voice and keep my commandments, then you shall be to me a unique nation, a unique people." And he said, "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." So there's number one, the conditionality of it. Number two, God's proposal was that they would be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. They were not able to fulfill that even at Mount Sinai because of their sin. So in Exodus chapter 32, before they left the mountain, you recall, of course, that Moses was on the mountain receiving the law of God, and he came down and saw that his brother Aaron had led them in fashioning a golden calf, and they were worshiping the golden calf. Moses was so angry he broke the tables of stone that upon which God had written the commandments. And he went down to the camp, and he had that idol ground up. That is, it was ground up gold, ground it up, scattered it in the water, and made the people drink it. And told them this. He said, "Whosoever is on the Lord's side, let him come unto me." There was only one tribe at that juncture that showed faithfulness to God, and that was his own tribe of Levi and his brother Aaron's, Levi. And the Levites came to him. Upon that day there were slaughtered 3,000 Israelites because of their sin at Mount Sinai. So consequently, the entire nation was not able to fulfill the proposal of God, the promise of God, that they would be a kingdom of priests. Instead, they were only one tribe selected, and there was only one family selected, the tribe and the family of Aaron, tribe of Levi, family of Aaron. And from that family, that is the family from which the priest came. And only the priest then would serve. And so now, in the wilderness and throughout all of Old Testament Israelite history, when a people wanted to worship God, they would go to the tabernacle and the priest would make the offering to God. So God was not able to fulfill the proposal that He had given them in Exodus chapter 19, that they would be a kingdom of priests. That would not be until the New Testament age, in which we're all called priests of God Most High, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. But it is also interesting here that they are called a holy nation. They lost their holiness, but they were still a nation. And so the first leg of the promise was fulfilled at Mount Sinai. And so Abraham's promise, that was Genesis chapter 12 and verse 2, found completion in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. But recall, it was on a condition, that if you would obey my voice and keep my commandments. That's number one. Let's go to number two. Number two is found in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7. And that is simply, unto thy seed I will give this land. So there's the land portion of the promise. Now it's important to note that there are many passages in Genesis that mention the land promise. So let's note them. They're on the top of the chart. One of them is in Genesis 13 and verse 15. Here Abraham has separated from Lot his nephew, but God reiterates the promise to Abraham, and He tells them that I will give this land to your seed, that is your descendants, after you, and it shall be their possession forever. Genesis 13, verse 15. Then we move to Genesis 15 and verse 18. God makes this statement in another reiteration of the promise, in which He states, I have given you, your descendants, this land. Notice He speaks in the past tense, I have given this land. But still there were conditions that they needed to fulfill. So I have given this land. That's Genesis 15, verse 18. Then we move to Genesis 17, verses 7 and 8. When the covenant was ratified by circumcision that was bound on the household of Abraham for every male to be circumcised, and God said very plainly in that juncture that unto your descendants, your seed, I have given this land as an everlasting possession. Consequently, the land promise is told to Abraham to be a promise that would last forever. It would be an everlasting possession. But now let's notice Joshua chapter 21. Moses could not go into the promised land, as you recall. Instead, Joshua led them in. When Joshua led them in, he fought wars in the center part of the country, the southern part of the country, and the northern part in order to solidify their position, all on the western side of the Jordan River. And as Joshua had finished his conquering and leadership in conquering, he gives this speech to the people, and it's Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45. Watch what Joshua has to say pertaining to the land. he tells us that they possessed the land, that is, Jehovah gave them all of the land, and he uses the word all of the land that God swore to the fathers. He gave it to them, they possessed it, and they lived in it. Verse 45, there failed not aught, that means anything, of any good promise that God had given to Abraham, all came to pass. It would seem from those statements that are there made that it would set this entire promise aside as having been completely fulfilled, that the land promise had been given to Israel under the leadership of Joshua. For he said very plainly, all of it has come to pass. There failed not anything of all of the promises that God gave to Abraham. All of it came to pass, verse 43 and verse 45. However, I emphasize it because today there is a spate of books, slew of books that have been published from the 1948 period till today, filling all the bookstores, paperbacks, novels, turned into movies, the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye. Many such movies and books are published that state that the land promise was never completely and totally fulfilled. Not only so, but that the establishment of Israel in 1948 was somehow a fulfillment of the Old Testament biblical promise given to Abraham. And that events in the world today, whether it be in the Mideast or in America, somehow are a fulfillment of the biblical prophecies that are given in the Old Testament. But much of it surrounds the idea and the concept that the land promise was never fully, never totally fulfilled with Abraham. And therefore, we are to somehow look today to the future, that the land of Israel and even the land on the other side of the Jordan River should be given to us still as Christian people today, and that we're to look for the fulfillment of that promise to Abraham. Now that's what is posited so frequently on every hand in almost every church in America. That's exactly what they teach. You go to the bookstore, the bookshelves are filled with books like this. You go to the movie rack, the day that you go to the rack, but you go see movies on Prime Video, whatever, that's the kind of movies you're going to see. So let's look at it. It deserves further exploration for just a moment. It would seem, number one, that when Joshua said, Jehovah gave unto Israel all the land that he swore unto the fathers, that would settle the issue. But there are three questions that we want to explore for just a moment. Number one, was the land promise totally fulfilled? Was the land promise ever totally fulfilled? Number two, what is the meaning of this word forever? Remember in Genesis 13 and 15, God promised to Abraham that his descendants would have this land and they would possess it forever. Or it would be an everlasting possession. Genesis 17, verses 7 and 8. So what is the meaning of the word forever? And then number three, let's notice this. Was the promise in any sense conditional? The promise of the land, was it in any sense conditional? Let's pick up the first question, and that is, number one, was the land promise ever totally fulfilled? I say that the Bible teaches very plainly and explicitly that the land promise was completely and totally and finally fulfilled in the days of Moses and Joshua. So let's look at a couple of passages that so speak. Number one is Exodus chapter 6, verses 4 through 8. In Exodus chapter 6, as Moses was in preparation to go to Egypt and bring the people out of Egypt under his leadership, remember that he actually resisted at first, God said this in verses 4 through 8. He said that the time had come that the promise given to Abraham pertaining to the land was to be fulfilled. The time has come that the land promise would be fulfilled. Now remember, this involves the integrity of God. God said in Exodus 6 that the time had come for that portion of the promise to have fulfillment. Let's reach down the corridors of history to the end of Old Testament history, all the way down here to, we're in 1500 BC right there. Now we're reaching all the way up here to 444 BC. And the leader of Israel at that time is Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes in the Persian kingdom. And Nehemiah is interested in going back to Jerusalem and building the walls. But in all of it, he recognizes that the time when they would come back from captivity has almost arrived, and he makes a lengthy prayer to God in Nehemiah chapter 9. In Nehemiah chapter 9, he's recounting to God in prayer what God has said and how God had made promises, and he speaks this way regarding the land promise. He says in verses 6 through 8 of Nehemiah chapter 9, that God, you have promised the land of Israel, the land of Canaan to this people, and you have performed your words. According to Nehemiah, God performed His words pertaining to giving the land of Israel to the nation, or land of Canaan to the nation of Israel. But there's more even also than that. Think about this. In Acts chapter 7, once again, speaking about the promise of land, Stephen is recounting the promise that has been given regarding the land to the Jews to whom he's preaching, the Sanhedrin Council. By the way, this was his death sermon. He was preaching it, and they were so angered by it, they're going to kill him. And they did. He said 2 times within the sermon in Acts 7. One of them is in verse 5. The other one is in verse 17. He said, when Moses goes into Egypt, or goes back into Egypt, that is, he had gone away for a period, he goes back into Egypt to lead them out, he said the time had come for the fulfillment of the land promise. Then in verse 17, once again, he reiterates the fact that God fulfilled the promise to Moses. So from the inspired words of Stephen in Acts 7, the inspired words of Nehemiah in chapter 9, the statement that Joshua made, all of the land was given. There's nothing that was left to be given that was not given to Israel as far as the land is concerned. So the idea that many people say today that the larger land of Canaan, the bigger land of Canaan, has not yet been given is actually false doctrine. It's error. It's simply error. But here's one more other consideration. Think about this from Deuteronomy chapter 19. Deuteronomy chapter 19. And the verses are 8 and 9. Now, Deuteronomy is Moses' 3 speeches to the land, or the people of Israel, before they go into the promised land. He was not able to go in. He was on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Remember, he climbed up to Mount Nebo. He was able to look over and see the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. Not able to go because of his sin. But he did have 3 speeches, impassioned speeches before the people. And that's what Deuteronomy is composed of, his 3 speeches. And in Deuteronomy 19, he says, when you go there, God has given you 3 cities to set up for cities of refuge. Now, what are cities of refuge? Cities of refuge were set up in a judicial system for a person who committed perhaps manslaughter, that is not a crime in the sense of premeditated murder, but let's say someone committed manslaughter. And they had an opportunity, and a person who did that, to go to a city of refuge, and there the case would be tried by a court. If they determined that there was premeditation in the killing that had occurred, they would turn him over to the manslayer, which would be the first of kin, which would be the obligation of that family member. So the family member would take care of it and kill the person. That was a death sentence for someone who committed murder. So there were 3 cities of refuge that were set up on the western side of the Jordan River. And Moses tells us that that was the case in Deuteronomy chapter 19. God has given you these cities. And these cities are set up on the western side. But note that carefully. One of them is Kadesh, far north. The other one is Shechem, right there in the middle. And the other one is Hebron, right in the very south. Those are 3 cities. But here's the important point. Here's the significance. He tells Israel in verse 9, if you do what God wants you to do and go in and conquer the land, and you obey His voice, He will give you 3 more cities on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And he tells us that would be a signal that God has given them all the land that He promised to give unto their fathers. When you come to Joshua chapter 20, verses 7 and 8, that's exactly what you read. They set up 3 more cities on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Golan, far north, which is today the Golan, what we call the Golan Heights. Ramoth Gilead, right in the center. And Bezer, in the far south. There were 6 cities of refuge. According to Moses, these cities were all given only if God would give them all of the land that He promised. So the answer to the first question is, yes, the promise was totally fulfilled. There failed not anything, in the words of Joshua. Of all of that promise, all came to pass. Number 2 question is, what is the meaning of the word forever? We hear so many people saying, from John Hagee in San Antonio and other people in the local pulpit saying, the land was promised to Israel forever, forever, forever. Genesis 13, 15, 15 and 18, 17 verses 7 and 8. The answer to this is very simple, and that is the word forever frequently has a temporal significance in the Bible. It means simply continually. For example, in Genesis chapter 12, or rather, let's go to Genesis chapter 17. Genesis 17 and verse 13. Here, circumcision is pressed upon the family of Abraham, as mentioned a moment ago. It was said to be an ordinance that was to be observed forever. And yet, we find that it was replaced in the New Testament, and Paul tells us in Galatians 5, if you seek circumcision, as in obedience to God's commands, you've fallen from grace. You're trying to keep the law of Moses. You've fallen out. So circumcision was not to be kept in an unlimited sense forever. Forever simply means continually. So also, for example, when we come to Numbers chapter 25 and verse 13, the Levitical priesthood. The priesthood of Levi was to be forever. That's the word that is used in the text. But in Hebrews chapter 7, we are told explicitly and pointedly that that priesthood died when the Old Testament died, and Christ is now the priest. Because He didn't come from the tribe of Levi, He came from the tribe of Judah. So the word forever is not used in an unlimited sense. It is limited, not unlimited at all. So also the Passover feast itself. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 14. In Exodus 12, when the Passover was instituted, it was said to be a Passover, a feast that would be observed forever. But in the New Testament, it has been relinquished. It is done with the Old Testament law, and we are told in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, our Passover has already been sacrificed, even Christ. And how about this as well? Think about the word forever. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, God tells through Moses the people of Israel, if they don't keep His word, they would have curses upon them forever. They didn't keep His word. They were cursed, driven out of the land. And that's exactly what happened. So how is it that they're to have curses forever, at the same time they're to retain the land forever? The truth of the matter is that forever simply means continually, and that land, they lost the deed to the land because of their unfaithfulness. So the word forever is not used in an unlimited sense, and that is frequently the case in the Bible. Let's go to question number 3, and that is, was the promise of the land in any sense conditional? Was it based upon conditions? And the answer is, of course, obviously yes. It was based upon the condition of their faithfulness to God. For example, Joshua chapter 23 and verse 16. This is Joshua's last speech before the people. It's an if you do and if you don't type of speech here. 23 and 16, he says, if you keep the law of God, then you will be able to retain the land. But then he says, if you go and serve other gods, and you bow down yourselves to them, the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and He will drive you quickly from off of the land, and you will perish from off of the land that He has given you. Is that a condition? Yes, it is. Yes, it's a condition. The same thing we saw in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant. God's promises have always been conditional. And they're conditional upon our compliance with what He has asked us to do and what He's demanded us to do. So the land promise was indeed conditional. The same thing is told us in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 17 through 20. Part of Moses' last speech. He tells them very plainly, if you don't keep the law of God, He will drive you off of the land and you will lose the land. That's exactly what happened. They disobeyed God. They went into idolatry. They were driven off of the land. And partially it was that driving off was fulfilled in the Babylonian captivity of 586 and completely in AD 70 when Rome sacked the city of Jerusalem. It was wiped out. But here's one more passage I want you to think about as we conclude this particular point. And it comes to us from Jeremiah chapter 19. Jeremiah 19. Jeremiah lived to see the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. He was right there when it happened. As a matter of fact, he wrote a long poem about it. And it's right there in your Bible. The book of Lamentations is his eyewitness account of what happened when Jerusalem was sacked. It's a sad read. But Jeremiah, as a last-ditch effort, inspired by God, goes to the people, the leadership of the people, and he goes to the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom is on the south side of Jerusalem. Jeremiah is told, you go to the potter's house and you get a clay pot. And you take that clay pot and you go in front of the people, and I want you to break that clay pot. And here's the message to Israel. As this pot is broken and cannot be made whole again, so it is with this people. You're going to be broken and you will never be made whole again. Never. How is it that so many pulpits resound with that Israel still retains its chosen people status? That somehow in 1948, that when Israel was established as a state by the United Nations, that somehow was fulfillment of God's promises. How is that the case? When Holy Writ plainly tells us it was a conditional promise to begin with, they failed the conditions, they lost the deed, and Jeremiah said they will never be made whole again. How is that the case? Because people don't study their Bibles, that's why. That's what's happening. Let's go to number 3. The third leg of the promise is found to us in Galatians chapter 3. Recall that the first line or rather the last line of verse 3 reads this way. That was Genesis 12 and verse 3. In thee, that would be his descendants, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now I want you to go to Galatians chapter 3 and beginning in verse 6. Let's look at Galatians chapter 3 beginning in verse 6. It reads this way, even as Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned unto him for righteousness. Know therefore that they that are of faith, the same are the sons of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. What did Paul say regarding that portion of the promise? In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. He said it was for Jew and Gentiles alike. Then let's go down to verse 15. Paul tells us, brethren, I speak after the manner of men. I'm going to use an illustration that comes from men. I speak after the manner of men, though it be but a man's covenant, when it has been confirmed, no one makes it void or adds thereto. By the way, that goes back to what we talked about in Bible class. You can't add to it, you don't take from it. No one makes it void or adds thereto. Now to Abraham were the promises spoken, and to his seed. He saith not unto seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed which is Christ. The final portion of the promise of Abraham to Abraham is fulfilled completely in Jesus Christ. So there's the story of the Bible. We have the nation promise completely fulfilled in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. That was conditional. We have the land promise fulfilled in Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45, when Joshua said they have all of the land. But it was conditional. He tells them that in chapter 23, verse 16. If you don't be faithful to God, He'll drive you off the land, and you'll not have right to possess it anymore. And that's exactly what happened. And then finally, the third leg of the promise is found in Jesus Christ. In thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So that means the question remains for us all, and that is, what is left of the Bible to be fulfilled? The second and final coming of Christ. That's what's still to be fulfilled. So let's look at this passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 as we conclude. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and it begins in verse 2. Paul writes to the Thessalonians, or the Thessalonians, And he speaks frequently in every chapter about the second coming of Christ because they had questions about it. They had misunderstandings about it. So here's how he puts it. Beginning verse 2. For yourselves know that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. When they are saying peace and safety, then comes sudden destruction upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, that is, birth pangs, upon a woman with child, and they shall in no wise escape. That will be simply suddenly. But he says this regarding, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. What does that mean, you're not in darkness? That means you're aware of it. You know that the promise is there. You know that it could be at any time. You, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. Then he says this, you're all sons of light and sons of the day. What does that mean? Sons of light and sons of the day. Those are Hebraic expressions, meaning simply you are enlightened people. You Christians are enlightened. You know the truth. You're sons of the light. You're sons of the day. You're not of darkness nor of the night. So then, let us not sleep as do the rest. Sleep. Spiritual lethargy. A lot of us are in spiritual lethargy, spiritual laziness. We're not aware of these things. We're not looking for the second coming of Christ. We're not in preparation for them. We are walking along in sleep. We're sleepwalking. So then let us not sleep as do the rest, but let us watch and be sober. What is left? The second coming of Christ. When will it be? I don't know. 1 year from now, I don't know. 1,000 years from now, I don't know. The Bible does not tell us when that will be. But it does tell us, you better watch and be sober. Let us not sleep as do the rest, but let us watch and be sober. The lesson is yours. The Bible outline is plain, simple. Threefold promise to Abraham. If you would have need of anything of this congregation, repent of sins, be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sins, now's the time to do it as we stand and sing, led by Brother Clint.